In the dimly lit salons of 19th century Paris, where gas lamps flickered against the damp stone and the echoes of revolution still haunted the boulevards, a quiet philosopher was asking dangerous questions. Hippolyte Taine, born in 1828 in the town of Vouziers, was no mystic, a historian by training, a philosopher by temperament, and a product of the rigorous École Normale Supérieure. He rose to prominence as one of the intellectual architects of modern French thought. Yet beneath his empirical rigor burned a strange curiosity, a willingness to entertain the idea that madness might be a mirror to the soul. Taine didn't study hallucinations simply as malfunctions. He wondered, what if visions, dreams, and deliriums weren't just broken thoughts, but revelations of something deeper? Long before Freud would speak of the unconscious, and decades before psychology became a formal science, Taine wrote of the mind as a layered terrain, where reason floated atop an ocean of sensation, memory, and instinct. He observed that in moments of fever, trauma, or mental illness, the human mind revealed symbols, images, voices, not random noise, but structured inner narratives. He asked, might hallucinations be messages? Might the so-called madman glimpse what the rational mind cannot bear to see? Taine's work, especially in his 1870 book De l'intelligence, would subtly challenge the rigid boundaries of science and philosophy. He didn't proclaim belief in spirits or gods. Instead, he gestured toward a middle ground between pathology and prophecy, a space where the human psyche might serve as both a malfunctioning machine and a mysterious antenna. Though Taine never considered himself a psychical researcher, his ideas laid the philosophical groundwork for those who would come after him, scientists like Charles Richet, who dared to test the borderlands of consciousness with experimental method. In that sense, Taine was a kind of reluctant prophet, a rationalist who opened the first cracks in the wall of materialism. Paris, 1857. While the salons of Saint-Germain buzzed with the chatter of positivists and literary critics, a quiet revolution in metaphysics was taking place just beyond the reach of the academies. It began not with a séance, but with a schoolteacher, a scholar, a rational man of the Enlightenment. Hippolyte Léon Denisard Rivet, a name almost forgotten in history books, would soon be remembered around the world under another name, Allan Kardec. Trained as an educator and deeply influenced by Pestalozzi's rational pedagogy, Kardec had spent decades immersed in science, logic, and moral philosophy. But in the 1850s, as spiritualist phenomena swept across Europe, rappings, trances, and messages from the dead, Kardec found himself drawn not to the spectacle, but to the possibility of a systematic science of the invisible. He approached spirit communication not as a mystic, but as a researcher. Over several years, Kardec compiled, compared, and categorized responses from dozens of mediums who claimed to speak on behalf of discarnate intelligences. From this, he distilled a grand metaphysical vision, Spiritism. In the Spirits Book, 1857, Kardec laid out his framework. Human beings are immortal spirits, temporarily incarnated in physical bodies. Life is a school. Reincarnation is the mechanism of moral and intellectual evolution. Death is not an end, but a transition. Spirits progress through countless lives, learning, suffering, and purifying, until they ascend to higher realms of wisdom and peace. Unlike Anglo-American spiritualism, which often centered on seances and empirical proof of the afterlife, Kardec's Spiritism was a moral cosmology, a guide for ethical living, spiritual discipline, and social reform. He believed that spiritual contact must serve human betterment, not curiosity, that spirits too evolve, and that higher spirits communicate only when met with sincere intent and elevated thought. In The Medium's Book, 1861, and Heaven and Hell, 1865, he expanded this worldview into a complete spiritual science, blending moral instruction with the metaphysical insights. Kardec's approach resonated with those disillusioned by rigid Catholic doctrine, but unsatisfied with materialist atheism. He offered a third way, a universe of reason and spirit, justice and mystery. By the time of his death in 1869, Spiritism had become a cultural force in France, but it was abroad, in Brazil especially, where his teachings would ignite a spiritual awakening that still burns today. Spiritism, there is not fringe. It is woven into the fabric of medicine, social work, and religious life. Allan Kardec, educator, philosopher, codifier, transformed the ephemeral whispers of the dead into a doctrine of eternal progress, grounded in logic, ethics, and an unshakable belief in the soul's journey beyond the veil. Paris, turn of the 20th century. In the shadow of the Eiffel Tower, as France reveled in its industrial and artistic golden age, a Nobel laureate dared to peer into the unknown. Charles Richet, physiologist, scientist, and staunch empiricist, was not a man given to superstition. In 1913, he received the Nobel Prize in Physiology for his groundbreaking work on anaphylaxis, the body's allergic reaction to foreign substances. He was a rigorous experimentalist, a man of microscopes and blood samples. And yet, this man of science would become one of the most important pioneers of parapsychology in Europe. Richet approached the paranormal with a language of his own. Rejecting the spiritualist terminology of ghosts and miracles, he coined a new, carefully neutral term, métapsychique, metapsychics, the study of phenomena that appeared to operate beyond the known boundaries of psychology, but not necessarily outside the laws of nature. This wasn't blind belief. Richet remained a skeptical empiricist, but an honest one. He believed that the duty of science was not to judge, but to observe, to test every phenomenon with the same rigor, whether it arose in a laboratory or a séance room. From the late 1890s into the 1920s, Richet conducted dozens of controlled experiments with the most famous mediums of the age. With Eusapia Palladino, the Italian medium notorious for her theatrics and psychokinetic claims, Richet introduced hidden devices, sealed rooms, and blind controls. With Marthe Béraud, later known as Eva C., he documented trance-induced apparitions of ectoplasm, a mysterious, semi-fluid substance believed to originate from the medium's body, forming human faces and limbs in dim light. He published photographs, transcripts, physiological observations. Some phenomena, he concluded, were explainable. Others were deception. But a stubborn few, persisted, even under strict control. In 1922, Richet published his monumental synthesis, Traité de métapsychique, Treatise on Metapsychics, a magisterial volume that examined telepathy, clairvoyance, levitation, precognition, and the materialization of phantoms, all through the lens of clinical skepticism. Richet refused to leap to conclusions. He was not a mystic. He did not argue for life after death, but he wrote with cautious gravity, "Some of these phenomena exist. They are facts, but facts which, for the moment, remain beyond the explanatory power of contemporary science." For Richet, truth was not defined by comfort or consensus, but by evidence, no matter how unsettling. He gave parapsychology a scientific language, a French vocabulary of the unknown, and ensured that France would be a central stage in the global inquiry into the paranormal. Paris, 1919. A city still haunted by the trenches of World War I, where millions had perished and families were left with aching silence. Amid the rubble of grief and the clamour of reconstruction, a new kind of scientific institution was born, one not devoted to machines or medicine, but to the mysteries of the mind. The Institut Métapsychique International, IMI, was the brainchild of Jean Meyer, a wealthy French engineer and philanthropist. Deeply moved by the war's staggering death toll, Meyer sought not consolation in religion, but evidence through science. He envisioned a laboratory where the boundaries between consciousness and death, thought and space, could be tested, not speculated. Inspired by the Society for Psychical Research, SPR, in England, Meyer established the IMI not as a séance parlour, but as a rigorous research institution. It was a bold idea that psychic phenomena, telepathy, clairvoyance, apparitions, could be studied with scientific tools under the gaze of trained psychologists, physicians, engineers, and philosophers. The early decades of the IMI were nothing short of revolutionary. It attracted elite minds like Charles Richet, Nobel-winning physiologist who brought credibility and clinical methodology. DNA Dr. Gustave Gellé, a physician with a deep interest in survival after death, who conducted some of the most controversial seances of the time, documenting ectoplasmic manifestations and trance behaviors with unflinching objectivity. René Waucollier, a chemical engineer turned telepathic theorist, who launched groundbreaking experiments on long-distance thought transmission. He used drawings, target images, and randomized protocols to test whether one mind could see what another imagined. His work would prefigure what is now known as remote viewing. The IMI's ethos was simple but revolutionary. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence, but evidence must be pursued, not feared. They implemented controlled test environments, double-blind protocols, photography, and instrumentation during seances, systematic reporting, statistical analysis, and cross-validation. While many of their findings remain disputed, the IMI survived world wars, intellectual revolutions, and ideological pushback. Unlike many early psychical research bodies, it never folded. It simply adapted. Today, more than a century later, the IMI remains active, hosting conferences, sponsoring academic collaborations, and engaging with emerging fields like consciousness studies, altered states, and psi research. In an age where mainstream science often avoids the paranormal like a contagion, the IMI quietly reminds us, science is not a belief, it is a method, and where there is a method, there can be courage to ask the forbidden questions. Dr. Gustave Gellé was no fringe mystic. He was a trained medical doctor, a rationalist by nature, and a man of precision. Yet by the turn of the 20th century, he had become one of the most fearless explorers of physical mediumship. That strange territory where the boundary between mind and matter seems to blur, and where the unseen manifests in the seen. After leaving his medical practice in Annecy, Gellé dedicated himself fully to psychical research. In 1919, he became the first scientific director of the newly founded Institut Métapsychique International, IMI, in Paris, and under his leadership, the Institute entered a bold and controversial era. What set Gellé apart was his clinical rigor. He wasn't content with hearsay or spiritualist enthusiasm. He demanded controlled environments, multiple observers, and photographic documentation. His most dramatic investigations were with physical mediums like Eva C. Marthe Béraud, a young French woman who, under trance, allegedly extruded ectoplasm, a strange white vaporous substance said to carry imprints of faces, hands, or symbolic forms. In controlled sittings, Gailey photographed these phenomena, often under red light, noting shapes that seemed to materialize from Eva's body, then retreat again, sometimes sticky, sometimes solid, sometimes evanescent. He also studied psychokinetic events, objects moving without contact, temperature changes, or table levitations. While modern eyes might view these as dubious, Gailey remained cautiously open-minded, always prefacing his findings with an appeal to reproducibility and independent verification. But Gailey's life ended in eerie fashion. In 1924, after attending a conference on metapsychics in Warsaw, Gailey boarded a private airplane bound for Paris. Aboard with him were Richet's unpublished notes on decades of psychical experiments, many of which had never been made public. The plane crashed en route, killing all aboard. The loss of both a man and a body of knowledge led to decades of speculation. Was it a tragic accident? Or, as some whispered, a suppression of revelations that threatened mainstream paradigms? While no evidence of foul play emerged, the mythology of that crash still haunts the history of psychical research. Gailey's legacy, though, endures. He believed that matter was not the limit of reality, but merely its surface, and that science had a duty to plunge deeper. His clinical notebooks, his ectoplasmic photographs, and his stubborn insistence on bringing discipline to the extraordinary still resonate with researchers today, many of whom still walk the uneasy path he helped clear. René Waucollier was a chemist by training, an engineer by profession, and a parapsychologist by vocation. Where others chased ghosts or waited for tables to levitate, Waucollier sat his subjects down with pencils and paper and asked them to draw what others, miles away, were seeing in their minds. It sounds simple, but it was revolutionary. As director of research at the Institut Métapsychique International during the mid-20th century, Waucollier led some of the earliest formalized experiments in extrasensory perception in France. His specialty was mental image transmission, a protocol that today feels like a prototype of modern remote viewing. One subject, the sender, was shown a target image, a simple drawing, geometric shape, or picture. At a distance, another subject, the receiver, would enter a relaxed or meditative state and draw whatever came to mind. These drawings were then analyzed for semantic, symbolic, and structural correlations with the target. Rather than focusing on hits or yes/no responses, Waucollier developed systematic methods for analyzing recurring symbolic patterns. He noticed that even when drawings were not literal matches, they often mirrored emotional tone, theme, or spatial organization. In essence, he was among the first to suggest that psychic transmission might not be a photograph, but a translation through unconscious symbolism. Waucollier published numerous scientific papers and his influential book, Mind to Mind, 1948, which became a touchstone in international ESP research. His methods preceded and in some ways surpassed the more famous work of J.B. Rhine at Duke University, who introduced the world to Zener cards in the 1930s. Where Rhine focused on statistical significance, Waucollier emphasized qualitative richness, the texture and ambiguity of the mind's psychic output. Warkolier's work laid the epistemological groundwork for modern remote viewing protocols developed later by the CIA and SRI in the US. He bridged science and symbol, blending engineering logic with Jungian subtlety. And he did it all with the quiet discipline of a scientist, not the flair of a showman. In the grand tapestry of parapsychology, Warkolier represents France at its most elegant and restrained, searching not for spectacle, but for structure, not for miracle, but for mechanism. Subscribe now and keep exploring with us.